Is history just records of whatever happened in the past? So, should there be a difference between history written in the East and the West? As Chinua Achebe had once said, until the lions have their own historians, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So history is often biased and skewed towards the side who wrote it. Yet, they can also be some of the greatest stories ever told, as both Herodotus in the West and Sima Qian in the East had spun some of the most amazing tales with our past thousands of years ago. These two historians are considered as the father of history and the grand historian by their respective civilizations, and they also profoundly influenced the surrounding civilizations. Even though they were not the first people to record history from their side, they revolutionized it by advancing it from a scribbled series of events into richly woven narratives. But the way they tell their stories were quite different, and in turn, it also revealed each side's perspective on how history is shaped. So, let's look at the differences between how the story of history is told in the East and West, using these two historical giants. Let's start with a bit of introduction. Herodotus. Not much is known about his life, but according to traditional accounts, he was a Greek historian born in Halicarnassus in the 5th century BCE, when part of Greece was under Persian rule. So that's why the history he wrote was mostly focused on the Greek city-states, Persia, and the surrounding areas. Herodotus was quite the traveler, and he journeyed around the eastern Mediterranean to interview people and collect stories for his book. Unlike most of his predecessors, he took a more evidence-based approach to his writing of history. After collecting all the information, he would interpret it according to the best of his reason. But of course, the ancient world was saturated with myths, legends, and gods. So accounts of phoenixes and winged serpents, which were thought to be real at the time, also made it into his book. That's why some of his contemporaries called him the father of lies. Nevertheless, his book, aptly named Histories, had profoundly influenced the way history is written in the West. And Cicero, the Roman statesman and orator, dubbed him the father of history, or padre della storia. Sima Qian was born in the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty period. He was the son of Sima Tan, the court astrologer of the Han Empire. Sima Tan started a grand project to compile all the known history of China all the way to the start of the Chinese civilization. But he died before he could complete it, and Sima Qian inherited his position and his homework. Like Herodotus, Sima Qian traveled across the land as he accompanied the emperor of the time Han Wuti on inspection missions and other work-related assignments. Besides getting to go on all expenses-covered trips, he also had relatively high status in court. So he had the privilege to access various court records, and he could interview virtually anybody. He was a meticulous historian. He cross-referenced his subjects and stripped off many of the supernatural elements, to a fault even. Some mythical figures was even turned into mundane historical persons in his book. His privileged position, however, came with its own risks. When he defended his friend, General Li Ling, who defected to the Xiongnu, the Han Empire's greatest enemy at the time, he drew the ire of the emperor and he was ordered to be executed. But back then, there was another option that he could take to reduce his sentence. A humiliatingly gruesome option many greater men considered to be worse than death. But since he had promised to complete the project he inherited from his father, he chose to live another day by enduring the humiliating punishment of castration. Even though he was mostly fair and conscientious, Sima Qian was not without bias. Despite being a subject of the Han Empire, he portrayed Xiang Yu, who was the first emperor of Han's greatest rival, quite positively. His completed work, Siji, which is commonly translated as Records of the Grand Historian, became a model for historians in East Asia. It inspired the oldest official Korean history book, Samguk Sagi, and was widely read among the Japanese literati who received Confucian education. So we know that these two blokes were smashing it at their job. They tell riveting stories of nations, kings, and heroes as closely to the truth as they could. But what sets them apart are the little stories they tell around these movers and shakers of history. In Histories, Herodotus dedicated a significant amount of its contents describing the geography and culture of his subjects. So in his conception of history, he considered the fates of these nations to be products of their respective customs and geography. As Herodotus himself once said, "Circumstances rule men. Men do not rule circumstances." Sima Qian, on the other hand, dedicated a major part of his book on the biographies of the little people, minor players in history whose lives nevertheless tilted the scales of history. He wrote about loyal ministers, philosophers, merchants, knight-errants, sycophants, jesters, and even villainous officials. So in his conception of history, it is almost as if he believed that history is driven by the will of the people, great or small, who wanted to make a difference. It is also somewhat ironic, isn't it, that in Asia, where the culture is often considered to be more collective by the West, believes that history is shaped by the individuals. But what do you think? Do you think that our history is a product of our environment, or is it driven by the competing wills of various individuals, big and small, who made a difference? Either way, I think there is value in both perspectives. And what our channel aims to do is to tell the story of history in the tradition of both sides. And with your help, we can improve our production and bring better historical contents to everyone. So if you like the history of Asia and want more of these historical narratives to be brought to the rest of the world, then be a bro and support us on Patreon. The link to our Patreon page is in the description below. There are quite a few reward tiers that you can support us on. If you can't commit to a monthly pledge, then consider making a one-off donation on Ko-fi. If you like us and can't support us financially, then you can still help by liking and sharing our videos to boost the algorithm. Also, remember to subscribe because we release a video every week. Until next time, stay cool, my bros.